Hello and welcome. I'm very excited today because I have a special treat. There is a very familiar voice, or at least for some of you, will be a very familiar voice who is joining me. But now I get to see the woman behind the voice. Marisa Calin is the narrator of several of my books, including the Evelyn Redfern series. And I thought we would have a chat today about what it is like not only being an audiobook narrator, but talking about developing the characters for a hopefully long-standing series. So would you like to introduce yourself properly and tell people a little bit about who you are?
Hello, everybody. I'm Marisa Calin, as was said. I have the great honor of narrating the Evelyn Redfern series and one of your books before now, two of your books before now.
Yes.
But I adore this series. I think it's fantastic. I've been narrating audiobooks for 15 years. I trained as an actor. I also, have been interested in, I've read a book. I have a lot of interest in literature in general. So this is the perfect marriage for me, audiobook narration. It's the perfect, it's everything that I love coming together. Yeah.
Well, I'm delighted to hear that because I get a lot of feedback. People get very invested in the narrators of their audiobooks, and they really, really, I think because the voice is such an intimate thing, and because people become so involved in the stories that they're listening to, they respond very strongly. So I've had several people reach out and say, she is doing the next one, A Dark and Deadly Journey, right? And I said, oh, she
Aw.
is, she is. I know she is. It's happening.
Oh,
So,
you can't get rid of me now. No.
well, I would
Um,
never want to. So.
no, yes, I can imagine. I think because you spend so much time with that voice, and uh, we're responsible for doing justice to what the author has done and bringing that whole world to life. So it's a huge responsibility and a privilege. Yeah.
Well, it's been so much fun seeing again. I think the first book that we worked together. It's funny because as an author, you actually don't have that much direct contact with your narrators because usually your part as an author has been done and dusted for a while, and then of course you get the manuscript when it is in its final form, and I'm usually at that point off writing something completely different. But we were able to meet because of The Last Garden in England, and I believe that was the first book that you narrated of mine. Is that right?
Yes, it was, and it was a larger cast, so
Yes.
there was a lot more communication between us about the time periods and how the stories intersected.
And it
So,
was a lot of fun, that book, because we actually got to meet all together on a Zoom call, which was recorded, and talked about that book and talked about the preparation. I know that people are always curious about, this world of audiobook narration because I think it's a little bit like being an author. Not that many people run into narrators, and so they're always like, "What does that mean? And what do you do?" So, would you mind telling us a little bit about sort of your side of the job? So, what happens when you get told, okay, we would like to hire you to be the narrator on A Dark and Deadly Journey?
absolutely. So it actually it varies very much between the publishing houses and how much time you often get. Sometimes it's less. Sometimes our schedules are quite full. But I with this, partly because it's a series, I get the text much earlier than sometimes, and I have more time to prep and to spend time with it. We'll get a pronounce, particularly for this one. The new book
Yes.
is is set in Portugal. So with the extra little the meat of the linguistic side of things, the producer on this is Brazilian. So there was she helped me. We have a word. First of all, we pull out the pronunciations for a word list, so I can start
Mhm.
working on things like that first. But in general, I get the text. I read it for the first time. I make character notes. I make notes about sort of the setting, the world, pronunciations, all of that. Uh, and then I can send a word list to the author often so that I get the names right and anything specific that's part of your vision is represented in what we're doing. Um, but mainly, again, it works in a lot of different ways. A lot of narrators are busy. They will use preppers to tell them all of the sort of story points and things like that. I think I approach it a little differently in that I think it's imperative to read the author's words because I think part of bringing a book to life is obviously the character. As an actor, I trained as an actor, so the character voices are the part that sort of come most naturally. But I think shaping narrative is a huge part of audiobook narration that is what keeps listeners engaged and invested and um, just sort of. So what I like to do is in my first read is, and I already know this with you because I'm more familiar with your work, but
Mhm.
just really listen to the author's voice and understand how they paint a picture, the sort of and it's slightly different every time because the character's different, but
Right.
the observations an author's going to make, the way they describe things, because I like narration to sound naturalistic as much as possible. So I want there to be sort of a flow of sort of a narrative conscience. So somebody is observing and bring that part of it to life, if that makes sense. So it's that there's no magic in that. It's really just reading the book and just allowing the way that the author observes the world to become my natural process of rhythm of speech, if that
Mhm.
makes sense.
I think it
Um,
does make sense. And it's interesting because authors often talk about voice, right? And,
yeah,
what voice are you bringing to this book? And I know when I started writing the Evelyn Redfern series with A Traitor in Whitehall, I wanted it to be a voicier voice, if that makes
yeah,
sense, than I had had before. It's first person narrative. I wanted it to have a little bit of that touch of the sort of His Girl Friday, snappy 30s and 40s comedies to it. Evelyn's got a personality and it's a big personality and it comes out on the page. Whereas I
yeah.
think with some of the third person that I write, it can be maybe a little bit more restrained than that and a little bit pulled back. And it's so interesting to hear that part of your prep is really looking for, okay, what is this author trying to do with this book? Even if I've read them before, what is it that the book sounds like in the flow of the narrative, not just the dialogue?
Exactly. It's night and day. So third person, even though you can still really kind of get in, you can still get invested in how everything is described from a third person point of view, so that it sounds again like a stream of consciousness for the observations that are coming. The first person narrative is absolutely different. It's so her voice comes through immediately. Her voice is, and it's, I wanted to say this to you, it's her voice is so of the time, but also so I don't know, just accessible. Like
Oh,
it's
thank you.
done a brilliant job of writing a character from the period, but in the most sort of uh, I don't know, yeah, just an approachable way. She's so easy to read, and she's there from the first line to the last. It's all her, and so your everything is unfolding through her eyes. So I love that. I think it's you can get really into the heart of a character that way.
Well, I
Um,
think I'm glad to hear that because she's a scream to write. It takes me usually because I've now written three of these, and of course you don't write them back to back. There's gaps, and you're doing other things, and um, it's taken me a couple of days usually to get back into it, and maybe rereading a couple of pages and a couple of chapters. I'm not a big reader of my own work,
yeah.
but then getting back into the flow and being like, ah, there she is, slightly sarcastic but very loving and all this.
Well,
Um,
do you are there things that you watch that you do that you sort of absorb to inspire you in her voice that takes you back to that time?
I'm a really, really big fan of anything Age Hollywood. I have been since I was a little girl. I think I was that kid where my parents looked at me and went, I bet she's gonna like this, and basically just put some of their favorite movies in front of me because when they met, they were going to a lot of dates at old revival houses. They were in Southern California, and UCLA has a great film program, so they were showing these films. You could see just tons of stuff. And so from a very early age, I had a lot of exposure to that, whole world of film. And I think there is something about, especially the women in noir, I really love. Usually a lot of sort of snap and pull and tension to their dialogue. And Evelyn is not a noir character by any means, but I wanted the idea that, she sees things slightly differently than convention, but she's still a product of her time and a product of her world. But she's smart and she's not afraid of the fact that she's smart and she doesn't suffer fools lightly, which is the way I would like to be. I'm not sure I ever actually am. She's a bit bolder and a bit more brash and a bit, about certain things than I am. But I think in that way,
Hilarious.
it's kind of living out the fantasy of what would I say if I was in this situation and I wasn't constrained by all the what will this person think and how will it go. So she's a scream to write for me because she has her moments of sort of being like, nope, this is the way it is, and I'm just going to bulldoze through and get things done. So.
Right. So what kind of research did you do to get all of the elements? Well, I mean, with all three books, but like the invisible ink, if that's a spoiler, I'm sorry.
No, no, it's
Things
that.
like that. Where have you come across all of those details? Because they're amazing and feel so authentic, and I love
Oh,
it.
thank you. Well, I read a fantastic book, and it's one of those nonfictions that has a very, very long title, but I believe it was Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare, and it talks about the early days of the SOE and what they did all through the war. So that's actually where I got the idea for Blackthorn Park. There was a physical location called the Firs that was what Q department in the James Bond films was based on. So it was the research and development facility. So I ended up pulling a lot of stuff from there, everything about mines and bombs and weapons and invisible ink and missions that people would be sent on. And sometimes it feels a little bit like you get a little breadcrumb of, oh, that's interesting. You kind of go down the rabbit hole, and that leads to something else, which leads to something else. And I think because of the first book being set in the Churchill cabinet underground, the what's now the Churchill War Rooms, which is a museum, a fantastic museum in London. Because of that, I kind of became exposed a bit more to what the SOE was doing because of the dispatches that were coming in to the cabinet war rooms. And then because I became a bit more exposed to the SOE, I learned about what became Blackthorn Park in my book, and then that led to, well, where were these, clandestine weapons and spycraft tools being sent? Well, they were being sent to the continent, and there was a whole espionage branch in Portugal. So it's a little bit like a treasure map that you kind of follow and follow and follow. And it's a lot of fun as an author because one little thing can become a huge part of a book. So there's always stuff to pull, always things to discover. But a lot of it is just reading a lot and trying to take in whatever seems interesting and chasing that.
Right. So for you, did characters come first or plot? Did you
Oh,
sense what was happening and then do you sort of feed your characters into the plot? Or do you have a sense of the people and then you find what it is they've been up to?
well, I definitely started with Evelyne first.
Sure.
And I'm so curious because of how I started, how you approach the narrative and building a character where, we knew that there were going to be three books in this first series. So, I was able to end in a way that didn't wrap the whole book up or the whole series up. So, we know that there's going to be more, right? So with her, I knew I wanted somebody who felt not completely, in she wasn't completely comfortable in the role that she was in when she starts at the beginning of the war. She wants to be doing more. She has this dual identity of being French and British. Her mother has this tragic backstory and she has an estrangement from her father. So I knew I wanted to plant the seeds of things that potentially could pay off later on in a series.
Right.
And then with that, to give her people around her that would kind of bring out those elements. So her aunt, who is my favorite character to write, I love
Of
Aunt Amelia.
course.
Um,
Yes.
again, talk about somebody I would be if I could. Aunt Amelia is just completely shameless about being a social snob, but she's kind of fabulous, and you get the sense that she did some things maybe during the
Mm-hmm.
First World War that she hasn't talked
That's
about yet.
true. Yeah.
And then, having a best friend in the form of Moira. And then, of course, probably most importantly, Evelyn's foil in David Poole. And all of those characters hopefully bringing out elements of her character and helping me sort of show the reader who this person is like. So I don't, how do you approach once a character like that is on the page, then bringing the life and the voice to them in a narrative?
Well, with Evelyn, it was it's so easy in a way because she is the voice of the book. So you sort of really just get into the groove with her. Um, I try to think about I think about her as a person and all her character traits, and then I try to make sure that whatever it is listenable for the duration of a book. So, um, with English, especially with English material, there's such as the socioeconomic aspect is such a big
Yes.
part of characterization. But I wanted to make sure she wasn't too upper class, that she would be inaccessible for people's ears. Sort of, you know, you want to feel like you know her and you're going along with her.
Yes.
So then I'll think about voice traits to make sure, again, I want to have a, when we're all the voices, you can't, I try not to pick a trait or sort of to lean into a character voice that limits the expression that I can give that character. So if a character is sort of described, because you know your job is also just to give us as much information as you can without that getting in the way.
Yes.
um, I don't want to put a character voice somewhere that will limit their emotional range. So I try to make sure I'm picking traits that still have scope. So if it's someone getting angry, they still have to sound like them. They
Mhm.
can't suddenly start sounding like my other character, who's often, you know, more aggressive in his vocal. Do you
Right.
know what I mean?
Yeah.
So it's such a map, but I try and pick traits that are easily distinguishable as that person, but allow me to still play the scene. Because I think most importantly for a listener, you want to experience what's unfolding. So I love to lean into the action that you've written, the emotion. So all of those things, you need space around each character for that, if that makes sense.
That does
So
make sense.
Evelyne, I sort of appreciated everything she was, and then I bring her as close vocally to me as I can, just so that she can then also still be everything that she needs to be. Um, so yeah, so I'll sort of find my voice for her, and then make sure I ground her in reality. I think it's
Mhm.
really what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, that makes sense because I think one of the things that, you know, one of the things that I know can break my experience as a listener to audiobooks is when something leans too heavily on stereotype or, it feels like a gimmick or a quirk to try to differentiate characters rather than really thinking about, okay, who is this character? How are they showing up on the page? And
Yes.
how would that manifest in, what it is that they're saying and how do I differentiate that from everything else? And I feel bad sometimes because I know I especially do this in my historical novels. I tend to throw a million and one characters down on the page and I edit them out as I edit and I
Oh yeah.
consolidate people but it's still to have a world, especially one where you're going around and doing an investigation and there's people who need to tell you, important information about alibis or what I heard or what I knew, you do get introduced to a rather large cast of characters, and it must be quite something getting your arms around all of those people and making them distinguishable from each other, even the small characters who only maybe pop up for a scene or two.
Yes, I would say the best example of that is the women and the typist in the bunker. We've
Yes,
got a shift of six women at a time, right? Of
that's right.
people who are likely coming from relatively similar geographical and socioeconomic backgrounds. But I mean, that's part of the fun. And also, they were distinct. Like you've made them super distinct, and then I just would take a sort of you make their personalities distinct, and then I would lean into something that would make, you know, someone a little more shrill or leans sort of becomes fearful more quickly, right? So
Mhm.
I still come at it from emotion rather than this person is high or low or this or that, because I do think it allows a little more range of expression. But like you had done exactly that. You like their characters were distinct in their personalities, and then vocally sort of things come out of that, whether someone is quiet, loud, fast, soft, all of that.
Mhm.
Yeah. But yes, that's so funny. So wait, you write more characters and then you'll pare them down into sort of consolidated.
I tend to, yeah. Some of the feedback I got, especially on Betrayal at Blackthorn Park, because that book changed a lot from the initial draft that I wrote and what I ended up eventually turning in as the final edition of the
Yeah.
book that went to print. I had more characters on the ground as, engineers and staff at the house. I had scenes that were where a character, Moira, was actually on scene and she was in with, there's a group of factory girls who are doing the manufacturing of these clandestine weapons. And I ended up cutting that because it was taking away from rather than adding to the actual mystery part of it. So I found that I needed to basically cut and consolidate characters down down. So I was able to get, what I needed to out of those characters and feed the alibis and all the red herrings and things like that. But I needed the scope to ironically be smaller because otherwise I think I was losing the threads of where everything was going. And in order to do that, I literally wrote an outline of everything, quite detailed outline of everything that happened in every scene. If there was an alibi, if it was true or false, or maybe it
That,
had been,
that's the part.
somebody. It
Sorry.
was it was intense, but it was really useful because then when I went through, because I got stuck around halfway mark in that book when I was initially writing it, and so I did this as an exercise to take myself basically from point A to point B and say, okay, you sort of ran out of plot and ran out of narrative. How are you going to fix that by, spreading this book out? Because mystery novels tend to be much more tightly paced than historicals, where I'm sort of following an emotional journey in a different way for characters. And so I went through and I did that. And as I would write, I would make notes. It was literally, like being in school, just having it jotted down on a paper next to me. And I'd revise those notes. And that's what ended up actually being such a huge help when I was revising the book because it still wasn't right, but I was able to go through the notes and say, okay, here is where I need to have a check in with our detectives who sit there and say, this is what we know so far. We think that this person's telling the truth, this person isn't. And so it helped keep track of quite a complicated set of lies and false alibis and things like that that ultimately ended up making it possible for me to pull everything together. When I started A Dark and Deadly Journey, I knew, you and I know, but I knew that there was going to be a big red herring reveal moment. And I knew that at the very beginning. And so I had to figure out how I was going to keep that from readers at an early stage. So I did the exact same thing where I plotted everything out and basically put how the person was lying or what the person was lying about and how it ended up resolving itself. Because there were a lot of threads to kind of keep going at once. It was tricky, but it was very satisfying.
Oh, I think a murder mystery, I mean, which they all are, must be the absolute hardest thing to plot
It's
because
it's tricky, yeah.
yeah, because you want to sow the seed throughout. Because I think the ones that are less satisfying are when you get the information that right at the end that makes you go, oh, well, if I'd known that, I could have guessed, right? So
Exactly.
you do an amazing job of sowing all the seeds, which is exactly what you need, what I guess is the difficulty of. So you always, when I'm fascinated when you lay out your murder mystery, you know what's going to have happened and who did it, and then you just sort of build
Yes.
from there. Or are you ever surprised about the journey it takes?
I think less so surprised about the journey it takes because I do, for me so far, and I've written three of them. So mileage may vary on, book
Mhm.
4, 5, or 6. You never know. It's the joy of writing, right? But I think for me, it's important to know where I'm going. So who and why is the
Right.
most important thing because just like writing a historical novel where you're following a character from okay, they're at point A in their life, and we need to take them on an emotional journey that's going to take them to point B, and their life will be different and changed and all of that for it. I think I want to know why them going on that journey and changing is so important and how we should be able to follow the thread all the way back to point A. So it should be a logical progression because although people aren't logical, people's motivations often are. So if somebody is a murderer in a murder mystery that I'm writing, my hope is that the reason that they have done that, while wrong, and we can all agree about that, they have their own reasons for having done it. And then there's the classics, right? Jealousy, money, infidelity, all the things. But everybody's reason and motivation for doing something is unique. And so it doesn't matter who the killer was in any of the books. I want there to be a grounded reason and why they decided to do the things that they did. And I think that that's when it's more satisfying. It's not because they're, psychopathic or, a serial killer. As fascinating as those books can be sometimes, with these books, I really want it to be about, they want something or they're threatened by something or, they feel a need to do this. And our detective is compelled by trying to stop them or catch them in that sort of false logic that they have. So it's a funny thing, and it does help. I find it to be a very helpful guiding principle. The journey along the way is not always straightforward. So
you're right though, because yeah, the emotional drive makes is such a satisfying payoff compared to an easy out like psychopath or yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
And so Evelyn loves the classic crime writers. Presumably, you
she
two
does.
you've read all of everything that you reference.
Well, I have I've tried to read everything I reference. I
Yeah.
swiftly realized she is more well read than I am, the way I've written her. So, behind me, behind that door, is a hallway that I'm at my parents' house right now, and they've built bookshelves all through the hallway, and it's affectionately called nicknamed Murder Hall because it's where my mother's murder mystery collection lives. And so, along with a lot of modern murder mysteries, there are also just tons and tons of the classics and things that I had never heard of really before I started to become interested in having a character who was so invested in reading contemporary to her murder mysteries. So um, I think with me, I've been trying to, there's the obvious Agatha Christie and Dorothy L. Sayers and people like that, but I've been trying to incorporate in some novels that maybe aren't such an obvious nod. And what's been really helpful is the British Crime Library is has been re-releasing these books, and they're beautiful copies. They all have this sort of um, in the UK, it's very easy to describe as the transit posters with the beautiful train locations, the sort of graphic 1930s look to them. So they have covers like that, and they're just wonderful. And it's things that I had never heard of before. And so I've been trying to pull bits and pieces. And the hardest part is when I need to reference a very specific thing. So at one point, Evelyn references in Betrayal at Blackthorn Park, surely there's a secret room or a secret panel in a room. And I was like, I have seen this before so many times. I know that there are books. It was so hard finding a specific reference to that would work, a title that would work with her sort of, wait a minute, I've seen this in a book before. Maybe I should look for this. So these tropes that come up again and again, they can sometimes be tricky to nail down, and you sit there and you think to yourself, I know I've come across this, but I had my mother, I had my husband, all of us were combing through titles trying to figure out what was it that we've seen this before, but what was it that the book was. So and it turned out I used a short story that's great. So it was nice to have a nod to that, but very
So
specific.
there was no particular crime writer that inspired you to
No, not really. I very much have enjoyed delving into that sort of world of detective fiction. And I thought for the time period that she was in, her sort of natural interest in crime fiction and also her realization that reading it and living the actual solving of a case, I try to give her a moment every book where she has a moment of thinking to herself, this is not a normal thing to be, looking at a dead body and trying to solve a mystery. This is not like my books. But as she's been more and more trained in sort of more and more an official capacity throughout the books, where she's having a little bit more emotional distance than that. But my hope is that she never loses the humanity of thinking, okay, this means that something horrible has happened and somebody's lost their life. So trying to balance that out.
I remember the visceralness of the blood-soaked cardigan in the first book.
Yes.
The way there was something, that sogginess that you described, that I was like, oh, this makes perfect sense. And then, of course, she gets shut in the room. It was a great opening
Oh,
to
thank you. That was
our
fun to write.
journey. Yeah, that I loved that scene. I love that
Yeah,
scene.
thank you.
It's fabulous. Because yeah, again, it's so lived in and visceral the way she experienced her first body, I guess.
Yes, yeah, and it's sort of I think people who are interested in true crime, interested in mysteries, they probably think about, could I do that job? Could I be a detective? But the reality of it, I suspect, is very, very different. I was a TV news journalist, so I wasn't actually doing the investigating or anything like that, but I was reporting on, and I was a producer, so I was putting shows together that had a lot of focus on really horrible things happening to people, and the reality is always very different than what you think it will be in your head. People used to ask, what's the worst thing you've seen? And I just thought, you don't want to know. You don't you think you want to hear it, and you don't want to hear it because it's quite frankly it's awful. So trying to have a little bit of that threaded through her character, what would it really be like to be the person encountering this for the first time, was very important to me. Um,
Yes, and no, and everything she does makes sense to me. And I certainly read things where I think, oh. they handled that exceptionally well, or but yes, her reactions feel very believable. And yeah, but also you're plotting these very intricate, complex murder mysteries, but also it's also the historical accuracy is amazing. And I can tell you that these books really make me miss my grandmother. That's
Oh,
know how well rooted they are in something. I think it's my grandmother was born in 1918 as well, because Evelyn was.
hmm.
Um, but she is a combination between Amelia and Evelyn. The
Oh,
to-
fantastic.
your turn of phrase, I don't know how you do it because obviously you are American in some ways. Um,
Yes, yes.
but
We can definitely talk about the fact that neither of our accents match the place where we're
I
physically sitting in
know.
right now.
But yeah, the Aunt Amelia's people being up and down. My grandmother used to say that. There are so many details that just really bring the time that evoke the time and place so brilliantly and so unobtrusively. I just feel like you are setting this the scene and the place without constantly reminding us that we're somewhere else. Does that make sense?
Well, thank you. That's a huge compliment. And it's funny, the up and down thing. I'm not entirely sure where it came from directly, but I am positive that some of what inspired that was Nancy Mitford famously wrote this essay about being you and non-you, sort of upper class and non-upper class. And it was all
Right.
about language and usage, which I think is really interesting, especially as an American who grew up saying certain things that would be considered very non-you.
Right.
And it's a whole class and snobbery thing. And I've been I've been interested in class for a very long time because I think there's a misconception that America doesn't have a class system. It absolutely has a class system.
Oh, interesting. Because
But
I often reference how how strong ours is compared. Go on.
and I think the British class system is much more, in some ways, much more upfront and much more calcified. So I think in America, the idea of moving up and down through the social ladder is certainly something that's talked about much more often, and I think is potentially more possible. I do think things are changing, at least from my perspective, sort of outsider perspective here in the UK. I do think there's more mobility than there used to be, but it is so interesting being somebody who is a dual national but was raised in the United States, and nobody would mistake me for being British except my husband, who always insists you're British as well, which is very nice of him.
Right.
But I know that I don't hit people's automatic ideas of you fit neatly into this class in the UK. And so it's been fascinating kind of watching that happen for myself. And so I've always been interested in my books with discussions of class, and I will be the first to admit I tend to write characters who are more on the sort of upper middle to upper class scale. Um, but it's just always interesting, that tension between things, and trying to understand it as an American, because I've been here for 8 years and there are still things that I don't understand and still things that I don't catch. Um, and so I think it's just one of those things. If you're interested in it, it will be endlessly fascinating. Um,
But
so
arguably, you understand it better because you're observing it in a different way than people who are embedded in it are observing it,
I,
right?
I think there
Like
is
'cause
definitely
you do it
something to that.
brilliantly because it's key, especially as somebody who is interpreting these characters and their accents. I mean, accents is my work. It's my life. I
Yes,
love them. I think linguistics is fascinating. But with accents, I grew up in Bath. I was born in California.
I didn't know
Both
that.
parents went home at my dad was teaching at Stanford. I went home at 6 weeks old to Bath.
Hmm.
But the Bath accent, people say, "Oh, you're from Bath, you're posh," but the local Bath accent is rhotic. It's a
Hmm.
West Country accent, as it would have been, with where because RP is an invention of the Industrial Revolution in
Yes.
1850. So anything really before that would have been a rhotic accent. Bath is still a rhotic accent, but it's a lower socioeconomic bracket. And then so every place has multiple accents within it based on where you grew up, what school you went to, how you grew up. So it's fascinating. But I think that also people within the system, we all are, sometimes you speak differently to be perceived differently. So
Yes.
my grandmother, who was just my favorite person in the world, um, her dad was a vicar, so she was somewhere in the middle, but she certainly adopted phrases to to present herself sort of a little bit
That's
more,
interesting.
right?
Hmm.
And her world. She was a nurse. She was in London during the Blitz. She, but her phrasing and the way she perceived people was quite class based, but also it, yes, it's just what you write and how you write the characters. Again, it's it's whether or not they're aware of where they fall. It's how, it's not just where you are or where you were born. It's how, where you want to be and how you present yourself.
I think that's absolutely true. And especially in a time period like World War II, where you do have the bringing together of people from different backgrounds. So whether that's geographic, class, in some cases race as well.
Yeah.
And then certainly you also have an influx, not quite at this time with my books yet, but you have an influx of Americans coming in as well at some point in the war. And then it gets really interesting because then people are really thrown into situations where, there was a lot of suspicion of the American GIs coming over, and then of course some people absolutely loved it, some people hated it. So, it sort of forces you to think of, I think, about your own place in the world, where you're coming from, where you would like to go to if you can get there, and all the things that you would sort of all the things that you might change, uh, but that somebody who knows what those markers are um, would know that you have tried to, make an alteration or a change to your voice or your presentation or whatever that is. So I always think that that's particularly interesting with the war. And in the case of A Dark and Deadly Journey, for instance, there was this perception that a lot of the people who were being sent for British intelligence were very well educated, had gone to public schools, cricket playing. And I have somebody I now watch cricket because of my husband. So it's a joke for me, but he has a photograph of himself in his cricket whites in his office.
Right.
And so
The
he's
Harrow and Eton boys got filtered into,
absolutely.
yes.
And sort of, were they the best people for the jobs? Maybe not necessarily all the time. Some I'm sure were brilliant and some maybe not as much. And so it's always interesting having that tension of, people coming together and having to work together, especially during a time of war for this bigger cause of trying to win the war. And what does that actually do, and what relationships are sort of comfortable and what are uncomfortable, and where is their tension? Because when you're an author, you're always looking for tension within your books, right? You want characters who are not happy all the time, they're not getting along all the time, because that's not particularly interesting to write about. You want things to be sort of you want things to be snapping and crackling on the page, as your narrative rolls along. So I think it's interesting with somebody, and I'd be curious to hear about putting together what you decided the voice and the presentation for David Poole is, because I wanted him very much to be a foil for her. Um, Sort of, she's willing to just give everything a go and she's determined and all that, and he's a bit more reserved, a bit more pulled back. Um, and we get to know him a little bit throughout the other books, but we haven't sort of really plumbed the depths of David Poole yet. So I'd be very curious, how do you, when you have a character who's obviously a partner or a foil to your main character, what are you doing to sort of set up some of that tension within the dialogue?
Well, that's funny because I feel like I have a really good sense of who he is. Not necessarily through fact or background information, but just how he operates in the world, which is
Yes, I think
with,
that makes a lot of sense. I've got some things that I would like him to still reveal about himself, but he's not quite
well,
there yet.
well, maybe I'm wrong about them, but this is fun. So, my impression of him is that he is well educated, but not privileged to the point of being uh, expecting everything to come to him easily. I
Mm,
think he went to Harrow,
yes,
right? So, I just he's sometimes one of the hardest things is to have someone be very straightforward. I think he's really straightforward.
yes, I
I
think
think
so too.
right. So I try to strip away anything that I would do with my voice that overcomplicates his motivations. I think he
Interesting.
is responsible. I think he's in the moment in terms of what's happening alongside her. She's a little more reactive in her
Mhm.
sort of enthusiasm and excitement, and will run after someone when he's less likely to do that. So I guess his reservedness. Yes, I wanted him I wanted him to sort of be simpler than some of the other characters, especially because some of the other men um, in the books are operating from places of much more complicated emotional places like hubris, entitlement. Like he's not an entitled man, even though he's
Yeah.
an educated man. So I guess he reacts to things rather than drives things for me
Yes, I think
and
so
how he
as well.
operates in the story. So she drives more, and he's a little more sort of he's just reacting to more quietly and more introverted into sort of what's happening around him. But I think
Absolutely.
but he's also super smart. I think he's great. I love him. But I
I,
do think I have a sense of him, but I'm so intrigued given that there isn't that much based in fact.
yeah.
But it's how he responds. It's how he reacts with interacts that makes me feel like I know him.
It was very important to me that he doesn't just follow her around and say, yes, 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 you get things right all the time. He would
Mm.
challenge her from time to time, but with good reason. And it wasn't
A
he
touch of
wasn't,
disapproval occasionally. A touch of
yes,
disapproval about how she goes about things, or just more like uh, reticence to, yeah,
yes, her sort of enthusiasm can baffle him a little bit
right,
sometimes. And I think, that the one thing I wanted was that he wasn't going to be the man who was going to sit there on the sidelines and say, well, I'm going to stop you from doing this because you're a woman, although he is still a product of his time. So every once in a while, she has to have a moment of saying, really, are you really going to suggest that you can do this and I can't do this? And I've proven myself. And he goes, yep, no, absolutely.
right.
Let's put that aside for now. And so I think for him, I wanted him to be perhaps a little bit more modern than his time, um, in terms of his approach to her and his approach to, here is a woman who's obviously very intelligent, who has a natural talent for this, but is untrained. And maybe in her enthusiasm sometimes and her lack of training, can pose some concerns for him about her own safety, how wise she is about going about doing things, but she gets results and she is learning and she is figuring this out and they're figuring out how to work together. And so, that straightforwardness and that supportiveness, he's sort of like a straight man in the
Yeah,
comedy sense, right? Where he's there to sort of to throw into relief the things that she's doing and to also help her figure out and puzzle through what it is that's happening around her.
and notably not respond like many of the other men to her being in the workplace because he isn't
Yes.
mentioning that and they are referring to her being a woman in the way that he tends not to. He did throw me at the end of book three in his
Yes.
death. I
Yes, so I
know what happens next.
I have a plan. I have a plan. But
I
no, so
hope so.
that is part of why I do say uh there are things with him that I haven't done yet that I would really like to reveal and sort of some of his backstory and his motivation for
We
doing what
know
he
he
does.
we know he's experienced loss.
Yes, and that loss is tied to why he does some of the things he does in book three, and where that could go from there. And it's the same thing
Protecting.
with Evelyn's father has a more prominent role in book three than he has in any other books, and he has his own reasons for doing things. So starting to sort of pull in other people's complications, to make Evelyn make some decisions and figure out a bit more about who she is, because hopefully with a long, series, you see a character grow and change throughout the series. And I think that's been one of the most enjoyable parts for me as an author is getting to take her from being, very eager but untrained, sort of eyes and ears in the typing pool, reporting back to this mysterious family friend. And now she's a full-fledged, field agent, and she's doing, she has a very prominent role in these investigations, and she sort of has a sense of herself that she didn't have before.
Right, right. Um, just out of curiosity, is there a big difference? Do you notice much difference in response from your readership from Americans to English, just in terms of the world building? Because again, I think it's fascinating as an outsider for anyone, and we're all slightly outside the time period. But I also, it's so resonant uh, for me with my Britishness
Mhm.
uh, that it feels it just it's so familiar.
Well, it's interesting. So I get occasionally, because there is no denying the fact that I am American first, and that's where I was born and raised. And so certain turns of phrase I know I have gotten wrong, and if I know that, I try to make sure that I correct that in future books. So, for instance, for the Betrayal at Blackthorn Park, I wrote the first draft. I just wrote train station through everything, which is an Americanism, and then changed it to railway when I was going through revisions because I was listening to my husband, and my husband's mother, my mother-in-law, has a beautifully correct accent and beautiful language usage, and um, there's almost a slight, she's not an old-fashioned person at all, but there's almost an old-fashioned quality to how correct and how lovely her speech is. And so I do sort of follow her around and listen to what it is that she says. And so I think when it comes to vocabulary, occasionally I will get a message from somebody saying, this wasn't quite right. I think you got that one wrong, which is completely fine, and I will, change that. What's interesting, the difference to me between sort of the world building side is I do get a lot of Americans saying, oh, it feels, just like being there and all of that. And then on the British side, I've had people write in and say, I remember that broadcast from Churchill, or I remember what the air raids were like, or, these things. And it's a much more sort of, rather than painting a picture for them, it's more bringing them back to a moment in time, or I remember what rationing was like, or, you know, some of the meals that you mention. And so that I think is much more of a memory evoking as opposed to creating a world that somebody never lived in, which is interesting.
Perfect sense, right? Because the way the Americans are looking at it, it's like a fairy tale. It's so
It's
without
escapist.
as opposed to within, and yes, so then it's evocative for the English who are seeing but memories. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think some of the most satisfying emails that I get are from people whose parents were serving during the war. I've had it with several of my historical novels where somebody will write in and say, I'm from Canada, but my mother, emigrated after serving in the WAFs or the ATS, and she was British and she never talked about it. But now I feel like I know a little bit more about what her life might have been like, and the things that she did. And I wish I had asked her questions. And I always find that I always find those the most satisfying emails because it feels a bit like helping fill some of the gaps in for some people. And so I try to be very respectful and careful about getting certain things right. And there are things that you just artistic license takes over because you don't know exactly what, certain things are very tricky. So my family always laughs. If you'll notice I never write out how much very small items cost in books.
Oh, that's funny.
And
Sure.
the reason I don't is because those everyday things can be very difficult to track down and get right, especially because decimalization came in the UK long after the war and before the war. I think I find it very difficult, and I do this every day. I find it very difficult to translate, pence and shillings and all the different. It was confusing. My mother rattles it off like it's no big deal, but she grew up with that,
Right.
and so I'm very careful about that, and I try unless I can really document it correctly, and it's probably really nerdy and 99% of people don't notice, but unless I can get an approximate, accurate timeline for a train journey and how long that would take,
Yeah.
I will not put in how long that takes because you're going to get an email from somebody saying, actually, it took
I'm
this long to this long.
I'm curious to know how long it took to fly from Bristol to Portugal
So I believe that was about 6 hours.
that's wild.
Yeah, because
That's
you had to fly out over Ireland and then
yeah.
down to avoid any potential hostile area.
I thought that was a fantastic detail because it doesn't take that long now. And so I was like, wow, what right, because also flying during the war was a different kettle
Very
of
much so.
fish.
Yeah.
Yeah, I thought but like those are wonderful details because
Yeah.
I oh yeah. So and because you're exceptional at research, I know that I know that what you've
Thank you.
yeah. So in terms of my side of the world building, I do sort of, you mentioned Churchill, the church. So I
Mhm.
found that and listened to it. Whilst I'm never going to sound like Churchill,
Right.
the intonation, the rhythm, all of that is sort of super important to my part of the world building. And then I'll often find things. that even though they're made now, I'll do a total immersion sort of a thing. I'll watch things that were set during that time for much like the golden age in Hollywood, sort of the rhythms of speech. Again, I don't want to jar anyone so that it doesn't sound normal. I want them to experience the story first and foremost. So I don't want to be talking in a funny rhythm the whole time. But at the same time, I will pepper in sort of enough of that that they are reminded of the time and the
Mhm.
place.
Well, it's
Uh,
interesting because there's such a sort of idea of what the vintage voice on radio would have sounded like, or that sort of very BBC intonation. Of course, that would have been people's connections day to day, because with television not being around, and
right,
people would have
right.
been.
You have way fewer voices in the world at large. That yeah,
Absolutely,
it,
absolutely. And
yeah.
so people would have relied on the wireless, the radio for their information and their news, and that's a style in and of itself. And so, yeah, it must be very tempting to go down rabbit holes of thinking, well, why don't I just look and see what that would have sounded like, or how somebody would have spoken in this instance.
Oh, they're joyful rabbit holes. I do. I think it just yeah, it informs so much because yeah, I mean you've done all the work essentially.
Well, I don't know about that. Sounds
But
like
then
there's quite a bit on your side as well.
well, mainly again, everything we've covered, the dialects, the accents, the yeah. So the Portuguese aspect,
Hmm.
uh, I thought was really fun. And one of the things that I can again say about the way I approach work is that I try to read fast enough. I know that a lot of people speed up their audiobooks.
Hmm.
I read fast. Some people complain about that. Just
Really? I'm
yes,
so surprised by that because I've heard so many people talking about bumping up the speed as opposed
they
to.
all do.
Yeah.
So many people do. So I want you to go at my speed
Mhm.
because I think we're experiencing the journey together. I think it's that I love this work. I think it's just one of the most exciting things an actor can do. You are taking someone on a journey for 14 hours, not a play, not a film. It's you are on this journey together. So I like to think that I can speak at a speed that
Mhm.
people will go with me. They will
Yes.
not like that 2.5 is the way to experience this
It
particular
sounds like
journey.
chipmunks.
Yeah. So I try to speak fast, but it does mean that I also refuse to slow down when I'm speaking languages that I do not speak. And I do a lot of books set in the war, but so I will often I'll have Nazis yelling in German, and
Mhm.
I will be in the studio with my engineer, my director, whoever's there, um, barking at people in German, but I don't speak great German, and I certainly
Right.
don't speak Portuguese. So even with this, with the Portuguese sentences, I refuse to slow them down. So it will be about 12 efforts for me to try and get out the Portuguese
Really.
sentences at a speaking.
Mhm.
So yes, well, but especially angry characters, like yelling Germans. I want the verisimilitude of the experience of the sound to add to the story.
Well,
Nazis don't yell slowly. So if
no.
I'm yelling, you know, aggressively, I will keep at it until I can hit all of the vowels and get the language right at a pace.
Well, it's
So
funny you mentioned that because before we started recording, I was saying, we were talking about narration and acting, and I think that there is a real difference between an author sitting there and reading their book out, and I can give a reading and I do an okay job at it. It is nothing like what you do when you are going through and narrating these books. It is just a completely different level, and I think that's where maybe people don't always appreciate until they don't have it, how much interpretation and acting and how that is really an art form in and of itself. And it's transformative. The work becomes something different than it was when you were just reading it on the page. And I think that's where there are a lot of conversations, obviously, about, quick audiobooks and AI and all sorts of things. And I think that the it loses that fundamental performance and all of the emotion and everything that comes along with that, and your experience as a listener. If you take all of that away, you're doing so much work as an actor and a narrator.
I think so. I think essentially the easiest thing in the world is to zone out, right? So if I think about my job as just trying to help someone stay engaged with the story, with what you've done, that's sort of that's the interpretation. And I think if anyone is telling you anything in too much of a one note way, it's very hard to stay engaged.
Absolutely.
I just try to make sure that there's movement. I think there's so much scope in audio, but I think there's so much move. So I think loud, soft, fast, quick. Some people want to be told a story in a just this is what happened way, and I respect that. But I want to remind people that I'm there with them and that this is happening and that this is my thought about it. And this is, do you know what I mean? I think there's
Yes.
so much. I think to keep a listener engaged, you want to experience it as you would in life, and we don't experience anything one note. We
No.
thoughts are left, right, and center all the time. So I like to think of a book happening to someone in the same way.
I think that makes a lot of sense, and it's, when we consume so much media, and a lot of it obviously is visual with movies and television and things like that. There is that dynamic there, and there is that sort of natural movement because you're literally watching things on screen. And I think the idea of bringing that to audio is even more important, maybe because you don't have the aid of visuals as well as the narration that you're hearing.
Right. Well, because everything lives in physical space too. So with Evelyn and just the things I love about, so like if she's, just to come up with a random example, if she's writing in a notepad, you write at a different pace than you speak. So
Mhm.
if and I wrote it down, like like your voice will shift with your physical action.
Yeah.
So even if you're just sort of putting on your shoes, I think everything lives in your voice. And I think if I'm just putting on my shoes or writing in my notepad and my voice stays the same, you don't feel the the movement, the action of the scene. So I think I think it's impactful to put as much of those things into like a even I mean I'm a lunatic, I grant you, but in the booth, if the character's smoking, I will absolutely be smoking my imaginary because it changes the rhythm of speech, right? It changes how you go about talking, how long it takes you to breathe through, and it's of course so much of the time. There's the whole scene with them buying from the cigarette girl.
Mhm.
So I will speak differently based on whether someone's smoking a cigarette in your books because they'll be on an outtake, like an in breath or an out breath, and they'll pause more. I just think that's the kind of thing that brings a text to life because you've chosen an audiobook. So you might as well enjoy it.
Yeah, and I think that makes complete sense because as an author, you're doing a lot in the background that nobody ever sees on page, right? Because the hope is that it feels effortless and somebody's just carried through the narrative and they love it. They're not sitting there and going, "Oh, and she did this, and then she pulled this little element of technique and she tried to do this and she used a rule of three here." And it's no, I want you to be enjoying what it is that
Yeah,
you're reading as much as I imagine it is with listening to a book, you're doing all of these things and thinking about them and trying to give that cadence and difference and
I'm
movement.
honoring the rule of three intentionally because I know it's coming. Because again, I sort of think that that what you have chosen to write is not a coincidence. The way that you've laid out patterns of thought is not a coincidence. So when a character is experiencing multiple thoughts consecutively at speed, they need to be received that way.
Yeah,
So I don't want to break it down. I want it to be like a rhythm of thought as thoughts tumble out of the character's head because that's what you sat down and did.
absolutely. And isn't that so much more enjoyable as an audiobook listener when you get to actually, you're not thinking, oh, and now this should really feel like it's faster or it's more jumbled or whatever it is. It just happens and you
It
get
just
to enjoy that as part of the performance and as part of the art form.
Yes, I hope you notice none of the deliberateness, just like you've been so deliberate about every word you chose and probably mulled over multiple sentences in multiple structures and just decide how it best reflected the moment. Exactly. I
Yeah.
want to deliver it to honor that, and I want them to hear it not with no awareness of the intention, but just the fact that that's how the moment unfolded for the characters
Yeah.
in their world. Yeah.
Well, this has been just absolutely wonderful and fascinating, and I feel like I could talk to you for hours and hours, which I think I probably could. And the next time we're in the same place, I'll make sure that we sit down for a cup of coffee and
A cup of
have a good
tea.
chat. But
Yeah.
this has been wonderful. Thank you again for this. Is there anything that you're working on right now that you want to shout out and let people know about? Other audiobooks or things coming up?
That's such a great question. Nothing springs to mind, especially. I'm No, my main closing hope is that we get more Evelyn. I
Me
hope
too.
that we have another trio of books on the horizon, or some kind. So, no, that's I've really I love talking about what we do. I
It's
love what
fun,
you
isn't
do.
it?
I love what I do, and I love when those two things come together yeah. I love the world you're writing. I think
Oh,
it's
thank you.
like I said, I think it's fascinating from a cultural point of view with Americans here responding to it as if it's a foreign language and land, and then people at home responding to it because it's so familiar. I think it's
Yeah.
amazing.
Well, it's certainly fun, and it's always great talking about it. So hopefully, many, many more books together in
I'm
the
here for
future.
good.
Wonderful. Well, thank you again so much for this.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.